On the 10th of September 2022, the world was watching the British royal family grieve. Queen Elizabeth II had died 2 days earlier, and a nation was in mourning. Outside the gates of Windsor Castle, a vast sea of flowers had appeared, thousands upon thousands of bouquets, cards, and candles left by people who had come to say goodbye. And then, into that sea of grief, walked 4 people who, by every expectation, should not have been walking together at all: Prince William and Catherine. And beside them, Prince Harry and Meghan. The so-called Fab Four, the 4 young royals who had once been the bright future of the monarchy, reunited in public for the first time in a very long while. For one extraordinary afternoon, the bitterest royal rift in living memory seemed somehow to melt away. And here is the part that made it so remarkable. It very nearly didn't happen. That image, which traveled around the world within minutes and dominated headlines on every continent, was the result of a single last-minute decision by one man. Not the king, not an army of palace advisors. Prince William. A quiet, 11th-hour move by the future king that, for a brief and shining moment, completely changed the conversation around his estranged brother and sister-in-law. This is the story of that move, what it meant, why he made it, and the heartbreaking reason it didn't last. To understand just how surprising that walk was, you have to understand how broken things were between the brothers by then. The rift between William and Harry was not a secret or a rumor. It was one of the most documented family breakdowns on Earth. It had been building for years, but it cracked wide open in 2020, when Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties and moved to the United States. What followed was a steady drumbeat of very public grievances, interviews, accusations, and wounded feelings, with the 2 brothers growing further and further apart. By the time the Queen died, the distance between them was almost physical as well as emotional. Both families actually lived within about a mile of each other near Windsor, the Waleses at Adelaide Cottage and the Sussexes, when in the UK at Frogmore Cottage. And yet, despite being neighbors, they were barely on speaking terms. So when the Queen passed away, the natural assumption was that the brothers would grieve apart, in their own separate corners, the rift too deep to bridge even in a moment of shared loss. To feel the full weight of that reunion, it helps to remember what the Fab Four had once been. The nickname came from a brighter time, around 2018, when William, Catherine, Harry, and Meghan appeared together as the glittering future of the monarchy. 4 young, modern royals who seemed to represent everything the institution hoped to become. They stood on stage together at the Royal Foundation, talked about working side by side on the causes they cared about, and were photographed laughing as a foursome. For a while, the public adored the idea of them, 2 brothers and their wives, carrying the family forward together into a new era. That was the dream, and it was precisely because that dream had so publicly collapsed, dissolving into accusation and estrangement within just a couple of years, that seeing the same 4 people walking together again at Windsor hit so hard. It wasn't just any reunion. It was the ghost of a future that everyone had been told was dead. Now picture the sheer weight of that particular day. The 10th of September wasn't just any day in the mourning period. It was one of the most significant days in the entire transition of power. That very morning, in a ceremony at St. James's Palace in London, Charles had been formally proclaimed king, an ancient ritual that, for the first time in history, was broadcast live to the world. William stood at his father's side as the machinery of monarchy turned over to a new reign. Across the country, members of the royal family were stepping out to view tributes and meet the public. King Charles himself had greeted well-wishers earlier in the day. The whole institution was in motion, grief and ceremony braided together. It was, in every sense, a moment of enormous pressure and emotion. And it's worth remembering that even the grief itself had not been simple or smooth for this family. When the Queen's health collapsed on the 8th of September, the relatives had scrambled to reach Balmoral in Scotland to be at her side. William traveled up with several other senior royals. Harry, by contrast, made his way separately, and by the time he arrived, his grandmother had already died. He stayed only briefly before heading back, a decision that itself generated a great deal of comment at the time. Harry would later give his own account of those painful hours in his memoir, describing what he felt was a cold and difficult experience around the travel arrangements that day. Whatever the full truth of it, the point is this: even in the rawest moment of loss, the tensions in the family were right there under the surface. There was nothing easy or automatic about these four coming together. Which is exactly why what happened 2 days later, on the 10th, was so striking. The unity at Windsor did not flow naturally out of a harmonious family. It was, on the contrary, a deliberate choice made in spite of everything that had just happened. And it was against that backdrop that William made his move. He and Catherine had already been scheduled to go out and view the tributes at Windsor that day. That part was planned. What was not planned, what nobody outside a tiny circle saw coming, was the phone call. At what royal sources later described as the 11th hour, William reached out and invited Harry and Meghan to join them. According to a spokesperson, it was William's invitation, extended directly, and the Sussexes accepted. The decision was made so late and so quietly that reports afterwards suggested even the security and palace staff weren't expecting both couples to appear together. Aides were, in effect, caught off guard. This was not a carefully stage-managed PR exercise months in the planning. It was a spur-of-the-moment gesture by a grieving grandson who, in that instant, decided that unity mattered more than the feud. What happened next was tender, and it was watched by millions. The four of them spent around 45 minutes outside the castle. They moved slowly along the crowds, reading the cards, looking at the flowers, accepting bouquets handed to them by members of the public. William was heard thanking people for their condolences, reading aloud a letter that a little girl had written, even stopping to pet dogs. Meghan was photographed wrapping a teenage girl in a hug. Harry, standing among the tributes to the grandmother he had adored, told the crowd something that captured the mood of the day perfectly, saying that no matter which room of the castle you were in, you could still feel her presence. And then, at the end of it all, the two couples climbed into the same car and were driven away together. For people who had spent years reading about nothing but division between these four, the sight of them side by side, sharing grief, sharing a vehicle, was almost overwhelming. There was a quiet symbolism in the setting, too. The walk took place on the Long Walk, the grand tree-lined avenue that stretches away from Windsor Castle, a place steeped in royal history and tradition. And along that historic path, four people who had become symbols of a modern family torn apart moved together through a crowd of mourners, doing the oldest and simplest royal duty there is: meeting the people, sharing their grief, saying thank you. Watch the footage closely, and you can see the small, careful choreography of it, the polite spaces and the gentle gestures, two couples clearly navigating something delicate and unspoken. It was not relaxed in the way the old Fab Four outings had been. There was a visible carefulness to it, a sense of people doing a hard thing for a reason bigger than themselves. But that carefulness only made it more moving, because everyone watching understood exactly how much it must have taken. This was not easy unity. It was effortful, deliberate unity, which is the most meaningful kind there is. This is why that single walkabout changed the conversation so completely. For 2 solid years, the only story anyone told about William and Harry was a story of conflict. How deep was the rift? Who had said what? Would they ever speak again? That was the entire narrative. And then in the space of 45 minutes, the picture flipped. Suddenly the question wasn't how bad is the feud, but could this be the beginning of healing? Commentators around the world seized on the image as a sign of hope. Many framed it as exactly the kind of reconciliation the late Queen would have wanted, 2 grieving brothers setting aside their differences to honor the woman who had loved them both. Royal watchers who had despaired of the relationship allowed themselves to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the shared grief of losing their grandmother could be the thing that finally brought the brothers back together. One gesture had rewritten the story, if only for a day. So why did William do it? That's the question everyone asked, and it's worth handling carefully, because there were competing explanations and not all of them were fair. The official and most consistent account, confirmed by a royal source, was simple and generous. William believed it was an important show of unity at an incredibly difficult time for the family. In other words, a future king, standing in the middle of a national tragedy, decided that the public needed to see the family together, and that the moment was bigger than his private grievances. There were, inevitably, more cynical theories floated in the aftermath. One claim suggested that the king had ordered the reunion, a version that was later firmly denied. Another suggested William had reached out mainly to stop the Sussexes from being filmed alone at the tributes for their own projects, a theory that was also later dismissed by insiders. It's only fair to mention those competing narratives, but it's also fair to say that the simplest and best supported explanation is the most human one. In a moment of overwhelming loss, William chose to extend a hand. Whatever complicated feelings lay underneath, the gesture itself was an act of unity, and it should be remembered as one. There's a deeper significance to that day, too, beyond the brothers. The 10th of September was, in many ways, the day William truly stepped into his new role. In the morning, he stood beside his father as Charles was proclaimed king, the heir taking his place in the new order. And by the afternoon, he was making a unifying gesture entirely of his own initiative. Together, those two moments offered a glimpse of the kind of King William might one day be. Royal observers spoke of him taking on a new mantle, of him and his father working in tandem now, and of William seeing himself as a unifying force within the family. The man who would one day lead the institution was, on the very first full day of the new reign, choosing to lead with an open hand rather than a clenched fist. For a family bruised by years of public conflict, that said something important about the future. But here is where honesty matters, and where the story turns from hopeful to heartbreaking. Because that beautiful moment of unity, the one that changed the conversation and gave so many people hope, did not last. It could not survive what came next. Within just a few months, the fragile peace shattered completely. In December 2022, Harry and Meghan released their Netflix documentary series, full of fresh and pointed accounts of their treatment by the family. And then in January 2023 came Harry's memoir, Spare, which laid bare the most private details of the brothers' relationship, including descriptions of arguments and even physical confrontations. Whatever tentative hope had flickered to life on the long walk at Windsor was, by early 2023, extinguished. The rift didn't just return. It deepened into something far harder and more bitter than before, a breach that, years later, still has not healed. There was one more flicker of togetherness before it all came apart. 9 days after the walkabout, on the 19th of September, the world watched the Queen's state funeral at Westminster Abbey, and once again the brothers were in the same sacred space, part of the same solemn farewell. But that was duty, not choice. The whole family assembled by the demands of the occasion rather than by any personal warmth. The Windsor walkabout had been different precisely because it was voluntary, a gesture nobody required of William. And it's that voluntary quality that makes its unraveling so poignant. There is a sad irony in the timing, too. Many believed that bringing her grandsons back together was something Queen Elizabeth herself had quietly longed for in her final years, that healing the rift would have been one of her dearest wishes. For a brief moment after her death, it looked as though her passing might achieve the very thing her life had not. Instead, within months, the opposite happened, and the family fractured further than ever. The reconciliation that her death seemed to promise turned out to be a mirage, gone almost as soon as it appeared. That's what gives the Windsor walkabout its strange, bittersweet power in hindsight. It now stands as the last time the Fab Four walked together in public. The last moment of visible unity before the door slammed shut, perhaps for good. When you watch the footage back now, knowing everything that came afterwards, it takes on the quality of a road not taken. There they are, four people who clearly could when they chose to. Stand side by side with grace and warmth. And there in that image is the proof that reconciliation was not impossible. It was right there within reach for one afternoon. and then it slipped away. It's worth sitting with what that tells us, because it cuts against the simple, angry version of this story that gets told so often. The Windsor walkabout is evidence that, beneath all the public warfare, there was still something real between these brothers. You don't pick up the phone at the 11th hour in the middle of your own grief to invite someone you feel nothing for. William's gesture was a reaching out, an offer, a hand extended across a very wide gulf. The tragedy is not that the brothers are incapable of unity. The tragedy is that they have proven they are capable of it and have not been able to hold on to it. That makes the whole saga sadder, not simpler. These are two men who lost their mother young, who walked behind her coffin together as boys, who were once each other's closest ally, and who, even now, occasionally show flashes of the bond that used to be there. And that is exactly why this one small royal move still matters, and why we still talk about it. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It was 45 minutes of two couples looking at flowers and thanking strangers for their kindness. But it changed the conversation because it reminded the entire world of a possibility everyone had nearly given up on. For one day, the story was not about what divided them, but about what they still shared, a grandmother they had both loved, and a grief that briefly was bigger than their differences. Years on, with the relationship between the brothers reportedly worse than ever, that afternoon at Windsor looks more poignant than it did at the time. It has become a kind of touchstone, the moment people point to when they ask whether the brothers could ever come back from the brink. Because they did come back once, even if only for an hour. They stood together. They grieved together. They got into the same car and drove away together. The question that hangs over the family today is whether that can ever happen again, or whether the 10th of September, 2022, will remain frozen forever as the last time the four of them walked side by side. It's striking, too, how powerfully the world responded in the moment. The footage led news bulletins across the globe, and the reaction was almost universally emotional. People who had followed the family's troubles for years spoke of being moved to tears by the simple sight of the brothers together. Social media filled with messages of hope, many of them invoking Diana, expressing a wish that her two boys might find their way back to each other at last. For a public that had grown weary of the constant conflict, the walkabout landed like a balm. That intensity of feeling is itself proof of how much people wanted this family to heal, and of how much weight a single, quiet gesture from William was able to carry. And it lands differently still when you view it from the present. In the years since, the relationship has only grown more strained, with the brothers reportedly barely in contact, and the wider family tensions resurfacing again and again, including amid recent reports of Harry and Meghan's plans to return to the UK. Seen from now, that afternoon at Windsor feels less like a beginning and more like a window that briefly opened and then closed. Every fresh chapter of estrangement makes the 10th of September, 2022, look more precious in hindsight, a reminder that the capacity for unity was there, and a quiet question about whether it could ever be summoned again. What's undeniable is what the move revealed about William himself. In the most pressured, painful, public moment of his life up to that point, with the eyes of the world upon him and his own heart breaking, he chose unity. He didn't have to. Given everything that had passed between them, few would have blamed him for keeping his distance, for grieving apart, for letting the rift stand. Instead, he reached for the phone. And while the peace he reached for didn't hold, the reaching itself told us something true about the man who will one day be king. When it mattered most, in the rawest moment imaginable, his instinct was to bring the family together rather than let it fall further apart. That instinct may yet matter enormously in the years to come, because the questions raised on that September day have never gone away. They have only grown sharper. The rift remains. The wounds remain. And one day, the decision about whether to truly welcome Harry and Meghan back into the fold will fall squarely to William, when he is no longer the dutiful heir making a kind gesture, but the king making a binding choice. When that day comes, People will surely remember the 10th of September, 2022, the afternoon he picked up the phone at the last minute and chose, against every reason not to walk beside his brother one more time. In the end, the most powerful royal images are rarely the grand ceremonies or the gold carriages. They are the small human moments that reveal what people are really made of. A future king in the depths of grief, quietly inviting his estranged brother to stand beside him in front of the world. It was a single move, made in an instant, and it changed the conversation around Harry and Meghan overnight. It didn't fix everything. It didn't last. But for one afternoon on the long walk at Windsor, it showed the world that the door was not entirely closed, and reminded everyone, perhaps even the brothers themselves, of what they had once been to each other, and what, against all the odds, they might still one day choose to be again.